So I think we can all agree that us Brits are not the best at learning languages, and I am definitely included in that bracket. But as we'll find out today, this was not always the case, with many people living in medieval Britain being bilingual. Now, today's speaker is Senior Lecturer in French at the University of Exeter and Principal Investigator on the Learning French in Medieval England project. So hello, Dr. Tom Hinton. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Been trying to keep out of the heat today.
Yeah, it's been very hot, hasn't it? Where are you zooming in from today?
From Exeter, so probably quite close to you.
Yeah, probably a couple of streets away.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for joining us this evening. And now I'll let you take the reins. Over to you.
Okay, so thanks everyone for tuning in. So to start this talk, I'd like to transport you back to the High Street in a medieval town. The visual aid on screen is one of Britain's most famous medieval streets, the Shambles in York. Try to imagine all sorts of sounds and smells, human and animal, mixing together. We don't often ask ourselves about what languages we might have heard on the street, which would depend on where and when our time machine took us back to. In some parts of the country, as in some of our communities today, you might notice regional languages, such as Welsh, Gaelic, or Cornish. Jewish communities maintained Hebrew as a language of everyday devotion. Internal migration, as well as external, brought diversity to many towns. A census of the immigrant population in 1440, which was carried out in order to raise taxes on them, mentions individuals from all over Europe, and even a few from further afield. So there's one husband and wife in London named as Benedict and Antonia, who are said to come from India, which probably means anywhere to the east of Jerusalem. Probably can't narrow it down any more than that. Flemish immigrants were a common sight, often coming to work as agricultural labourers, weavers, or merchants. The question of how long immigrant languages were maintained by these communities and how far they spoke them in public is a difficult one to answer. With Hebrew, for instance, we can probably assume it was confined to private religious devotion, given the prevalence of anti-Semitic violence throughout the period. One place we can look is within the English language itself, which bears the traces of language contact in its vocabulary and in aspects of its structure. Many northern place names and dialect words derive from Norse in areas that were under Danish control during parts of the first millennium. And Dutch has provided English with a number of nautical terms, including skipper, sloop, iceberg, buoy, and yacht. And this can probably be attributed to the presence of Dutch traders and sailors in English ports. These four passages are from texts written in medieval Britain. The green one is Norse, from a saga written in Orkney. The red one is a dedication to Henry II in a collection of stories in French. And the yellow one is Middle English, from a religious text written for three sisters who had decided to live as hermits. See if you can recognise any of the words in these three passages as ancestors of modern English words. And I'll just pause here to let you look through them, but I won't pause too long, so just do a quick skim read. So see, I'm going to guess that for most people here, the all three texts feel quite foreign. Time obviously is as much of a distance as space. In that first text, the Norse one, you can see the word storm on the equivalent of the modern English storm on the first line, and then a little bit further along the word land. In the French text, I think you'll find there's quite a lot more vocabulary that jumps out, whether that's honour and noble on the first line, joy on the third line, assemblée, assemble on the second to last line, and then rhyme in the last line. And then in the Middle English, lefty is lady. You've got the word beset at the end of that line. Land again, land in the second line. And the word castle at the end, you might have noticed. Although castle comes into Middle English already by this time from French. The fourth text here, the blue extract, is a Latin word list from a manuscript used in teaching Latin. So it's teaching Latin vocabulary. The smaller words on the right are what we call glosses. That is explanations or translations of the words to help students understand the Latin. And that concept of the gloss is going to be relevant to the text that I'm going to talk about today. So just wanted to get that in there early. So these glosses you might be able to see are either in Latin, And when they are, they're giving a simpler synonym or a description to help you understand the main word. They're in English, like the gloss for concilia, which is a whelk, or like the first word here, cartellum, they're in French, tenel, which is a basket. So that's the first clue that students learning Latin in Britain with this manuscript are able to refer to both their French and their English vocabulary to help them. No language had a greater impact on English in the Middle Ages than French. And in this talk, I'm going to try to give you a sense of who spoke French in medieval Britain and why, what they thought about their French, and how they understood its relationship to the French of France. So let's go back to our medieval street. Let's say we're around the year 1300. The dominant language is English, of course, but if we duck into a tavern, over in the corner, two merchants are having a lively conversation in French. One is English, the other is French, and has been in town for a week or two to sort out some business interests. A couple of streets over, a little further out of town, we find a school where the English merchant's son is listening to his master. Among his classmates are the son of a local gentleman and a poor boy from a nearby village whose schooling has been sponsored by his local priest in the hope that he'll one day take religious orders himself. The schoolmaster is explaining the basics of Latin grammar in fluent French. Just outside, two clergymen are discussing a sermon they heard at the cathedral that morning. Their French is probably interspersed with Latin words and phrases. Finally, walking over to the town's main square, we're just in time to see a town crier arrive to read out an official proclamation on behalf of the local authority. He begins, oyez, which is French for listen, listen, and goes on to read out his message in the same language. So the explanation for French's importance in medieval England has to start with the Norman conquest. But it's important not to tie linguistic and social questions too closely to military events. It used to be thought that 1204 was a key date here because that was when King John suffered a significant defeat and Normandy passed from English to French control. The theory was that this led the English nobility to cut their ties with their continental possessions, and therefore the use of French began to fizzle out, with English now preferred. But that theory is based on the assumption that the British only spoke French in order to communicate across the Channel, and it ignores all the evidence that the French spoken in Britain, which I'm going to call Anglo-French now, actually expanded in use from the 13th century on, especially in administrative and religious contexts. What can be agreed is that by the middle of the 15th century, something significant happened. English is being preferred now in almost every domain, and French is being presented as a foreign language in textbooks from that time. By this time, French has left its mark decisively on English vocabulary, with huge numbers of words being incorporated, both into everyday language and into literary works by the likes of Chaucer, the father of English literature, who was a civil servant and the son of a merchant, must have heard and spoken French on a regular basis. So to give you an idea of the kinds of words that English has taken from French, I've put this arbitrary list together. Some of these concern areas of life restricted to the rich and powerful. So you can see there's a lot of language of politics and warfare, whether that's status terms like baron, prince, or I should do this in English, shouldn't I? Baron, prince, parliament as well, judge and jury and so on. Also attack, castle, as I mentioned, tournament. Also the vocabulary of money and travel and trade. So duty, customs and border. Money, rent, lease, finance, treasure, arrival, departure, and delay. But other words here are much less marked and available to all levels of society, including language of emotion and of the natural world. And a number of modern dialect words, which, if anything, are associated with lower registers of language, come from French. So where I grew up in Derbyshire, an alleyway was called a jitty, which comes from Old French jeter, something that juts out or connects two streets. In Durham and Scotland, the equivalent dialect word is venel, which comes from the French venelle, a little vein. So if we go back to the timeline, one recent rough estimate suggests that the French-speaking contingent in England may have gone from about 15,000, which is less than 1% of the population around the time of the Domesday Book survey at the end of the 11th century, to around 1 million or 20% of the population by the start of the 14th century. I suppose what interests me is how we get from 1% to 20%. I talked about etymology a minute ago as a way of identifying what languages have been used in the past, but it's not as simple as it sounds. How exactly did so much French vocabulary come into English? What everyday situations led to monolingual English speakers imitating the speech of their bilingual peers? Well, the answer has to include something about French's prestige through the period, its association with power and getting on in life, at school, through business, or as part of the inheritance of noble culture. It also has to involve bilingualism, people who knew both languages and were used to switching between them on a daily basis, depending on the situation. For the rest of this talk, I want to look at a French work written in the mid-13th century called the Treatise. It's a sort of rhymed textbook for teaching French. Each manuscript has its own version of the French text with a different set of English glosses. I told you that that word would come back. Like a lot of medieval texts, the surviving copies of the work are from later than when it was written. So you can see here, the latest manuscript that survives comes from the early 15th century, which means that by looking at the text, but also at its individual manuscripts, we can understand better what's going on between the loss of Normandy and the period when native transmission of French in Britain seems to have largely ended. So the Treatise, so the Treatise, actually, I'll stick with English pronunciation for this as well. It's surprisingly difficult to decide what the Treatise is actually for, what kind of French it's teaching and how it's teaching it. And one of the places that's been looked to first for clues is the preface that you find in some, but not all, of the manuscripts of the text, not unreasonably. And this preface gives us a name anyway for the author and commissioner of the text. So it tells us that Sir Walter de Bibbesworth wrote this text for Lady Denise de Montchensey for learning language. Walter de Bibbesworth was a minor nobleman. He was a knight with holdings in Hertfordshire and Essex. He wasn't that important that there's much known about him, although there are a few things that we know. He was King's Forester for Essex, which was a position of some responsibility. Basically, he had to protect the forest and make sure that people were not stealing the king's game. And he fought for the English army in Gascony, which reminds us that even after the loss of Normandy, there were still actually all sorts of reasons for people to be hopping across the channel at this time. Denise de Montchensey must have been one or several levels up on the social ladder. Her first husband was Walter Langton, who fought in the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, alongside Simon de Montfort, who gave his name to a university. Her second husband was Warren de Montchensey, and Warren de Montchensey was one of the barons who revolted against King John, which a revolt that led to the Magna Carta. And both she and Warren were direct descendants of Norman families who had come over with William the Conqueror. So we're looking very much at an aristocratic transmission of French in terms of the recipient of this teaching, if we take this preface at face value. High aristocratic. On the other hand, Bibbesworth himself is from the lower aristocracy. But it's very clear from this text that this is being pitched as a text for nobles to keep up their French. As it says at the end of this little extract that I've got here, the forms for conversation which any gentleman ought to know. There's a second preface, which is also found in some but not all of the manuscripts. And in fact, with the exception of one manuscript, they either go for one or the other or none at all. And that separate preface is rather different. I call it the letter because it's written in the voice of the author, although it doesn't identify him or the woman for who he's writing. So if you take these two prefaces together, you can say, well, okay, it's Bibbesworth writing to Denise. But you can see that's a sort of an interpretive move that scholars are making. So that letter says, "Dear sister, since you asked me to put into writing for your children some kind of concise lesson in French, I have done so according to what I myself learned and as far as the words came to my memory, so that children might know the properties of things they see, or we could say the names of things they see, and when they should say mon or ma, son or sa, la or le, and moi or je." So it's possible that neither preface is actually by Bibbesworth or contemporary with him, but they can at least tell us about how the text was being understood. And it's clear that this is being seen as a text for teaching the names of things, which is not surprising because that's effectively what it does, but also teaching gender, if you take that last sentence seriously. And as anyone knows who's learned French, gender is a major difference between the two languages, between French and English. and therefore is certainly something that the English, even the bilingual English, would need to learn. But I suppose a bilingual, you would expect a bilingual learner of French, or someone who's growing up with both languages together, to encounter gender quite early as a concept, but they might not always get it right. And I think I want to hold on to that thought for a second. I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. Handily, the Treatise has got some advice about when children in 13th century noble families should be taught to speak French. So it says quite early on, when your child reaches the age of beginning to speak, you should tell him first in French how he should describe his body. In this way, he will be better versed in speech and not mocked by others. So if we take that seriously, and I don't see any reason not to, French is going to enter into noble children's lives in the 13th century very early when they start speaking. And so by the time they're using the treaties, it doesn't seem that they're using it to acquire French. They must be using it in order to improve or perfect their French, and that's something that I'll come back to. So it's teaching names for things, it's teaching gender, it's also teaching children about the natural world and the social world, such as these kinds of thoughts about the fact that if you don't speak French properly, then you might be mocked by others. It's clear then that speaking your French properly is a badge of status at this time in England, and it's about impressing, or if you want to put that more negatively, not embarrassing yourself in front of your peers. So in terms of what the Treatise covers, it's a bit of a window onto aspects of aristocratic life. You get discussion of early childhood, parts of the body, clothing, food, animal noises, then a range of occupations: harvesting, baking, weaving, brewing beer, fishing, the garden, bad weather, trees and flowers, woodland birds and beasts, parts of a plough and a cart, building a house, hosting a meal, and it concludes with preparing a feast. You can see there's quite a variety of topics that are covered here, but certainly you could see aristocratic life, the management of an aristocratic estate, as something that binds them all together. In terms of how it works, if I show you a page from the treatise, you can see you've got your rhymed French. Okay, so it's rhymed in couplets, so French verse, 8 syllables a line. There's a heading here, which you get these kinds of headings in most of the manuscripts. Here begins the first property, what belongs to the head. So it's the language of different parts of the head. And then you can see the glosses. Some of them are just above the words and some of them are in the margin, which give you, for example, 2/3 of the way down, the last line, the last word of one line is cervelle, and then you've got brain in the English next to it. So it might sound a little bit like this. Basic language learning for the early years of life. In this case, this is from early secondary school material. But I think they were really, actually putting the two side by side really shows what the treatise isn't, because you can see what that Key Stage 3 language learning sheet is doing, is teaching you individual words. And the wraparound language for all this is English. Yeah, you get your explanation in English, simple stuff, just learn all the parts. And then even at the end, get this vocab in your tête at the end. So the French word that you want to learn is dropped into the English structure. Clearly, the treatise is doing something quite different, because here, all the English is doing is clarifying and confirming individual words within the French. But you need to have French good enough to actually make sense of the full sentences that you get. This isn't just a list of words. This is a rhymed text. What both kinds of texts do try to do in their own way is to make learning fun. See the kind of the cartoonish pictures in the Key Stage 3 document, and then there's a little humorous tag at the end. The treatise, how the treatise does it, on these pages, we've got the following lines. So if you look, those 3 red swishes on the left-hand margin, the third one down towards the bottom, I'm going to start reading from there. I'll translate into English as I go. So you have graceful eyes, but they have gunk in them. Okay, so it's teaching you the word for, not so much the word for eyes, which is kind of taken as a given for people at this stage, but actually the word for the gunk that you have in your eyes, which I'm not even sure if there is actually a recognized word in standard English for that. Here it's spawned, it's spundy. So you have graceful eyes, but they have gunk in them. Take the gunk out of your eyes and the bogies out of your nose. And it's one of my real joyous discoveries when I was starting working on this is that the Middle English word for bogey is maldrop. And then it carries on the next page. If my purse was as full of, I should say, on the next page, what it's going to do is start distinguishing between the word rupee, which in French means, in medieval French, means bogey, and the word ruby, which has the same sense as the modern English word. So he says, if my purse was as full of rubies with a B, as my nose is full of rupees with a P, I would indeed be rich. So that's a nice example of the way in which it plays around with language. It's interested in making distinctions, making sure that you pronounce properly, perhaps, making sure that you are clear about the differences between words that sound the same that might be confusing. And it wraps it all into this, hopefully you found slightly amusing anecdote, which kind of plays on the kinds of things that make children laugh, right? Embarrassing bodies and disgusting things. So looking at, that's all I'm going to say about the text, I think, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on to talk more about it, but I want to talk about the individual manuscripts, the text now, and looking at how looking at individual manuscripts tells us about who was learning French in the 14th and 15th centuries. So we've seen that the text speaks to an aristocratic audience, but the manuscripts were owned by a much wider range of communities. Many of these manuscripts are associated with clergy or religious houses. So this one was owned by the nuns of Laycock Abbey, which is now a National Trust property. Another manuscript was the personal copy of a monk at Buckfast Abbey in Devon. Another one was the manuscript of a friar in Hereford. So you can see we're sort of dotting around the country and seeing that religious institutions are people in religious institutions are very interested in these texts that teach French. Other manuscripts show how French became important in professional contexts. So one manuscript now in Oxford includes a large number of model letters for professional secretaries to copy. This manuscript was owned by Sir John Moore, who was a lawyer, who was also the father of Thomas More, who wrote Utopia and was executed by Henry VIII for not approving his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. At the end of this manuscript, Sir John wrote down the date of his wedding and of the births of each of his children as they were born. So you get a sense that this book was kind of important, an important part of family life over a period of many years. And I think that really brings out how a way in which each manuscript has got its own character. You can kind of sense that by doing the kind of thing that I've been doing in terms of talking about what the manuscripts, who owned the manuscripts and where they were kept when we know that. But you can also get a sense of a manuscript's character in terms of the way in which it works with the text. And this manuscript here has got especially chatty glosses. They don't always just translate a French word into English, which is what I was saying to you earlier on, the French was doing. So you can see here the bits that I've copied out. It says, concerning sage, oak, and yew, there is no disagreement about the words that you use. And you can see that the gloss there, the red bit over on the right-hand side, is in French. So sometimes in this manuscript, the glosses are actually in French themselves, which means that teaching, which suggests that teaching using this manuscript to the treatise would have taken place bilingually. In other words, this is not teaching French to English speakers. This is teaching French, I think, to bilinguals, people who already have at least some French. My favorite gloss here is the one on the second line. So the text is talking about the elder tree, and then it goes on to talk about a pudding that you can make from elderflowers. And the gloss turns this into a recipe, noting that it's made with milk. And you can imagine the scribe of the manuscript dreaming of elderflower pudding, or sueur, as he wrote this gloss. Each manuscript opens a different window onto the use of French, and two manuscripts can give different impressions of how the language was perceived. So this is my last extract from the text. This is from a manuscript that's now in Cambridge, that may have been associated with Durham. It suggests that French users, oh, sorry, I should read it out first. So it's talking about the woodcock. It's part of a section giving the names of birds. And it says, see the assis hiding over there, which is then glossed, you can see on that top line as woodcock or woodcock. French wants you to say it like this, for Wiedecock is the style of the townsfolk of Yorkenville. So this suggests that French users in Britain are used to dropping English words into their French. You can see how Wiedecock is a sort of Frenchified version of the English word woodcock. And the text is trying to convince them to use the proper French word instead of doing what some of us perhaps do on holiday when we can't speak a foreign language and we just try and say the English word with a foreign accent. So here in a discussion of the woodcock, the word assis is recommended as correct French, and woodcock is presented as the kind of word, incorrect word, that you would hear on the streets of Yorkenville, and that's York to you and me. I think perhaps this is exactly the kind of imperfect French that the Treatise is warning you that you might be mocked for speaking. That sense of switching, and there's all sorts of evidence in, particularly in administrative documents, that is going on at this time. So you've got documents that are written in 3 languages, English, Latin, and French, which seem to show that you've got bits of French and bits of English being stuck together. And although one of the big challenges of what I do and of working with this kind of evidence is that you only have written sources to go from, I think there's scope to see these administrative documents in multiple languages as reflecting multilingualism on the aristocratic manner in towns. In another manuscript, though, which is now at the British Library, there's a passage in this little bit about the woodcock, which is not found in the others, and which radically changes the sense of these lines. And I think it really nicely shows how variable French's status was in medieval Britain. So it notes that many people call the widecock an assis, but this is not correct French. They should be called widecock. So you can see that this manuscript now is contradicting the one that we just saw before. It's saying actually widecock is the right name for them. But in order to make sense of this, I think we need to reinterpret that line. French wants you to say assis, wants you to say it like this, the third line from the bottom here. And I think we can reinterpret it. The French is français veut que ici le dit, so French, français. Instead of understanding that as the French language, we can understand it as French people, right? And that would give you something like that. So see the assis hiding over there. The French want you to say it like this. For or but widecock is the style of the townsfolk of Yorkenville. So that, I think, makes this make sense as a whole. This manuscript is saying, actually, in France, you might say assis and you'd be understood, but within the English realm, it's perfectly understandable and perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's correct French, correct Anglo-French, to use the word widecock, this Frenchified English word. So hopefully this talk has given you some idea of how and why French functioned in medieval Britain, and probably also how much is still unknown to scholars. And I'm hoping that in the questions now we can go a little bit further into that. The project that I'm currently leading is aiming to edit all the manuscripts of Bibbesworth's treatise to bring out the kind of evidence I've been discussing tonight. And when those texts are edited, they'll be available on our website, which you can see the link for here. And you can, in the meantime, it's going to be quite a while, probably going to be till next year now. In the meantime, you can check our site and our Twitter feed to get more info and updates on how the project is progressing.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tom. And so we can follow you on Twitter there. You've given your Twitter handle, Medieval French. Awesome.
Medieval French, yeah, we were very pleased that that wasn't taken yet.
Yeah. So we've got lots of questions. And it was fascinating to see. I love the slide where you showed the GCSE textbook and compared it to the Tretiz. That brought back many memories of being 16 trying to revise for my French. So I'm going to just crack on with the questions, if that's all right. Yeah. And if you're listening and you've got a question, do type it in the Q&A function because I've got my eye on it. So the first question is from Carmen Zimmerman, and they ask, is it possible to ask the questions in French? And I'm afraid my French didn't progress past GCSE, so I'm not going to be able to ask any in French. It's all going to be English. So question from Sarah Powell is, are there any examples of the Tretiz produced or used outside of England?
No, there aren't. It's one of the interesting things about this whole culture of learning French is that it's very much English, despite all those links. So Bibbesworth, he's hardly known for having written anything, but the only other two things that one is pretty certain that he wrote and the other is likely that he wrote are, one of them is a debate poem about going on crusade, where Henry de Lacy, who was Earl of Lincoln, asks him, is it okay for me not to go on crusade, even though I've promised I would, because there's a lady here in England who really doesn't want me to go, and I feel like I'd be doing her a wrong if I did. And Bibbesworth answers, no, that would be a sin. Effectively, he's very serious about it. But what's interesting about that is the only instance of that kind of crusade debate poem written, that's known to be written in England. So in order to write that, Bibbesworth and Henry de Lacy have got to be reading and being interested in what's going on the continent in terms of literary fashion. So it's not that he's not plugged into what's going on the continent, but the treatise itself really seems to have been written for English, Anglo-French speakers.
Okay. And so Susie Crockford asks, from the original text that you showed us, it looks as if French has changed far less than English over the centuries. Is this correct? And if so, do you have a theory as to why?
Gosh, I'm not sure. They've definitely changed a lot, is what I'd say. I mean, I think if you present a bit of medieval French to a native French speaker who hasn't ever studied it, it would take them a while to make sense of it. So I think I sort of want to say it's roughly similar in terms of that they both change, but I don't know. I'm not sure how you'd quantify it. So I would say probably, I think I'd want to emphasize the differences between medieval and modern French. One of the really clear things, for example, that has changed in French between the Middle Ages and now is French at that time had a kind of case system, a simplified case system, like Latin has, like German has, and other languages. So it had two cases, and an S on the end of a word might mean that it was a masculine plural word, or it might, sorry, a masculine singular word, or it might mean that it was a plural word, a non-masculine plural word. So that's quite confusing for a modern French speaker if they come and look at a medieval text, because they're thinking, well, what does this? Also, it means that if you have a case system, you could kind of leave words out and so on. So I think it's still pretty challenging.
Okay, and what about today? Are languages still changing at the same rate today as in the past, or are things changing? I'm just thinking because we're in such a globalized world now, and things are documented quite hard.
I think that language is certainly changing all the time. The ways in which it's changing and the forces that act on it obviously are going to be historically dependent. So we're in a much more documentary culture. We're also in a much more sort of we're in a video-oriented culture as we're seeing now, right? And so there's all sorts of ways in which language will be affected by the technologies we use that aren't going to be the same as the technologies of the Middle Ages. And the problem that I alluded to a bit earlier of working with written sources and trying to work out things about how people led their lives is partly one of technology, because wasn't the technology to record oral speech or oral production at the time. So you're reliant on written sources, and then you have to be very careful how you interpret them.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so we've got a question here. A person hasn't left their name, but would a French speaker in England have been understood by a French speaker in Lyon or Paris?
That's a great question. Yes, I think so. I think there are, so again, this is the kind of thing I mean, like, well, how could I know? I wasn't there, right, when they were talking. There were written texts which record, so sometimes these are literary texts, sometimes these are conversation manuals, which record conversations between characters. If we take those as kind of anchored in reality, then what you find is there are encounters between Anglo-French and continental French speakers where sometimes the Anglo-French speaker is mocked for his French. This is a bit like probably I'd want to say it's less like the way that say the English are mocked sometimes if they speak a language by a native speaker now as a foreign language, and more in the way that, say, a Belgian might be mocked by a certain kind of nationalistic French native speaker today, in terms of your accent being different, or perhaps the kinds of unpleasant jokes that might have been made in the past about Irish accents and so on, might still be made. So yeah, there are those encounters. So the fact that they're mocked means that they can be understood, but clearly also there's an awareness of linguistic difference. And I think sometimes some of these texts play up, like that last extract about the woodcut that I was talking about. Those texts play up those differences for sort of rhetorical purposes, or to kind of make a point about how you should have proper French, whatever conception they've got of what proper French is. Whereas actually I think that the situation is a lot more fluid right through the Middle Ages. And I think, you know, you're talking about an era before there's a sense of standard French. So if you move around France, you'll hear all sorts of different dialects and all sorts of accents as well. And people are going to be quite comfortable, actually, in reality, I think, with speaking across dialects and across languages even.
Yeah. And we've got a question here from Holly Dempster Edwards. So I was wondering, how many manuscripts are there of this text, and is it mentioned in other texts in English or French? And do we know of any other similar texts for the teaching of French, or is the Treatise unique?
So the Treatise is not unique, but it's the first the earliest known text for teaching French anywhere, actually, not just in England. In terms of the number of manuscripts, there are 17 manuscripts, which is, it might not sound that much, it's quite a lot for a text from the 13th century. And they are spread out over the country, which suggests it was popular. The other thing that suggests it was popular is that little bits of it are found in other texts for learning French in England. So you can see it sort of starts a bit of a trend, or perhaps I'd like to say when people in the 14th century are writing French language learning texts, this is a model for them. So this is what they're looking at. And so there's a nice little anecdote about the way in which all the different ways that you can say red in French. And it describes, it's a little description of a knight, red-haired knight on a red horse, carrying a glass of red wine, probably not something to be tried at home, and a red shield in his other hand, and he eats nothing except red herrings. In the French, all these words that are read in English are different. And that's taken up in later texts as, so there's a text called the Orthographia Gallica, which is ostensibly about French pronunciation and how to pronounce good French. It's much later, and it's much more influenced by an idea that creeps up in the late 14th and early 15th century, which is that the best French is the one spoken in Paris. It teaches you pronunciation, but then it also includes that as a little example of the way in which there might be diversity in one language, but not in another. So the fact that these texts are incorporating bits of the treatise into them shows, I think, its influence.
Mm. And if we zoom forward to today, there's quite a few questions about language learning in the UK today. So this one from Jamie Bollum. So what languages do you think should be taught more or less in the current education system? Do you think the UK should be focusing on certain languages?
I think, is it ducking the question if I say I think any language learning is good? I mean, I think the biggest issue in this country is the fact that languages are not compulsory anymore to GCSE as they used to be, and the follow through that leaves in terms of language take up later on. Because one of the things that people often say to me when I tell them that I teach French at university is, oh, I wish I'd carried on with the language. But there is this problem, which hopefully I've shown that both our GCSE textbooks and the treatise try and deal with, which is that the early stages of language learning are boring. I think the thing about the treatise, it's more easily able to deal with that because it's not teaching you the early stages, it's about perfecting French. I think that means that there has to be a certain amount of encouragement and hand-holding and compulsion, unfortunately, at the early stage, to make sure that people are still plugged into a language by the time it gets interesting, as it were. I think that, so that's the main thing. I think there's certainly an argument that there needs, we've sort of historically, we've obviously been very oriented by European culture and growing up as part of Europe, developing as part of European culture. And there are clearly other languages now, as Europe doesn't dominate, and Europe, I include the UK here, doesn't dominate the world in quite the way that it did. There are arguments that languages like Chinese clearly are they're becoming very popular as well, and Arabic as well. But I'd like to think that we can bring those in alongside the languages that we're still studying. So this isn't an argument about stopping studying European languages and starting to study non-European languages. I think all languages, the more languages we're learning in this country, the better it will be for us.
Yeah, and where did your passion for French start? Did you learn French from a young age?
So yeah, I'm actually, in a way, I mean, it's one of the things that fascinates me about this text is it speaks to me on a personal level. So my mum's French and my dad's English, and I grew up speaking both languages from birth, and I'm bringing up my children to speak both languages as well from birth. So that has actually informed, in a way, my hunch about this text, that it's about not code switching, not changing, not dropping those English words in. And that's partly probably influenced by the number of times that I'm reminding my children of words for particular things, saying, don't forget, you know that word in French. But there's this, there's an ease in terms of, if the word that comes more quickly, you will use it, whichever language it's in. That's sort of natural. And it takes a certain amount of training to habituate yourself to a particular word, in a particular language, if you're more used to hearing it in the other language, using it in the other language.
Yeah. So my brother and sister-in-law are expecting later in this year, and my sister-in-law is French and my brother is English. And so I think they're planning on bringing up their child bilingual. Do you have any top tips? Like how did you go about doing that?
It really, I mean, I think there's no one size fits all. So it's really got to be something that the parents both feel comfortable with. I think that's important. I think a certain amount of consistency is helpful. But I think mostly trying to avoid it being a source of conflict is important as well. I think the more you can present it as a source of joy, I think reading actually is a really powerful part of that. So like Bibbesworth's children that he's talking to, if they're learning French alongside English very early on, then they can learn to read them together, and that's what's happening with my children. And then they can just crack out a book and enjoy that, and that's going to be huge for their vocabulary. The other thing I'd say, I think, is not to worry about the English. If I'm assuming if the children are growing up in England, not to worry about the environmental language, because when they start school, that will come. So if the focus needs to be anywhere in the early years, I'd say it's more beneficial that it's on the home language, if you like. And the schools, a good school, and our school, for example, is very supportive of children with English as an additional language, that it says, that's our job to teach them English. And, kids are like, they're sponges, so they will just pick up English very, very quickly. So I'd say the home language, the heritage language, is probably the one, if it's possible, the one to focus on early on. But mainly make it fun as well for yourselves as well as for the children.
Yeah, great. So just going back in time, we've got a question here from James Fenner. So when did multilingualism decline in Britain, and what changed after the medieval period in order for this to happen?
I think French use declined, I'd say. I'm not sure that multilingualism has ever declined, because I'm sure you could find someone who works on the 16th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, who could talk about how many different languages are in use at that time. To give one example that I was reading about today, there in Norwich, in Norfolk, in the let me try and get this right. I think in the 16th century, there was either 16th or 17th, there was an influx of refugees, Huguenot refugees from the Netherlands, who brought Dutch with them. And for about 150, 200 years, some of them were French speaking, some of them were Dutch speaking. And it seems that those languages were still used within Norwich, if you look at town statutes and so on, and records, right the way through for about 100, 150 years. So English was obviously the main language in Norwich, but I think something like 1/3 of the population of Norwich at that time was made up of foreigners. So there are going to be these localized stories, and then national stories where languages are going to be moving in and out of the country. It's all about now. I mean, in a sense, it's not that I don't know if it's that we're worse at learning languages than we were. It's that we've not seized the opportunities that we have as a country from the multilingualism in our midst, where perhaps other countries have seen that advantage more quickly, and perhaps because of English's role as probably the dominant world language at the moment. There's a sense, I think successive governments have had this sense, well, English will do. But of course, what that forgets is that the more languages you can speak, the better you can communicate with a wider range of people. And being able to talk to, say, in a business deal to someone in their language is a way of making a connection with them that you can't if you don't have that linguistic ability. and that can actually have economic benefits as well as the kind of spiritual.
Yeah, yeah. And we've got a question here from Hilary Thompson. So are there any parallel cases? For example, how long did the Orkney remain Norse and presumably English speaking after Norwegian rule ended?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about Norse, I have to say, so I did drop it in. So it's kind of my fault that I got that question, but I'm afraid I'm not a specialist, but I know I could say that certainly sort of Norse in the north of England and Scotland, I don't think, my understanding is it didn't survive very long after the end of what's called the Danelaw, when they were actually Danish rulers. So by the time of the conquest, of the Norman conquest, I think Norse has probably receded from being more than sort of etymological or sort of heritage signs, the kinds of things I was talking about. But I'm afraid I can't go any further than that in terms of talking about. I suspect that Orkney and Shetland, because of where they are, there's a good chance that they would have maintained the languages quite a while, but that's something that people have to look into for themselves. Great.
And we've got a question here from Agashiwich, I don't think I pronounced that right, sorry, about how what are your plans to engage this research with teachers?
Okay, so yeah, so there's a part of this project, the research part that I've talked about, is to study and edit these manuscripts. But there's also a public engagement side. So one element of that is kind of telling these kinds of stories to a wider public. Particularly, hopefully you'll have sensed through what I was talking about that there are local stories to be told here, like that monk from Buckfast Abbey. There are specific connections. One manuscript was owned by a canon of Exeter Cathedral, that's sort of someone on the governing board, who then founded some almshouses that are in the city centre that are now ruined, and everyone walks past them and their children play in them every day in the city centre. So there's a way in which these manuscripts open up heritage stories, I think local heritage stories, that is really interesting to think through, and thinking about how multilingualism is part of that heritage story. Then the other strand is something that's not going to happen now, I think, until certainly, well, sometime next year, given all the disruption that schools have had to suffer through the coronavirus crisis. And that would be to work to plan 2 workshops with school teachers, probably mainly local school teachers, where we look at how we can use this text and this story to plan resources that would actually be genuinely useful to teachers, hopefully not just teachers of French, but teachers of English, teachers of history as well. I think, hopefully you got a sense that these are part of the, French needs to be part of those conversations as well. I mean, I studied the Normans at school, but I don't think we really said anything other than, of course, their language was French, and it didn't go any further than that. And it would be great to find ways of bringing that to life a little bit more, and then using that to help students and children at school to think about the multilingualism in their own communities. Even if they themselves are monolingual, how being part of a multilingual community is enriching for them. So that's very much at the embryonic stage at the moment, but hopefully it's something that these workshops next year can flesh out, and who knows, might be the springboard to something a bit more sustained in time.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting, and it might inspire some of the kids to learn a language as well.
I hope so, yeah. I mean, I think we're sort of at the end of hopefully towards the end of a decline. There seem to be signs of green shoots in terms of engagement with languages. Now, I think political bodies are waking up to the importance of learning languages and of encouraging language learning. So I'm hopeful that we do start to see greater engagement in sort of coming years, and looking further ahead, even decades.
Yeah, and just following on from that, we've got a question about Buckfastly. So is that manuscript still in Buckfastly?
No, these manuscripts travel around, and so the kind of the post-medieval history of a manuscript is usually that they get hoovered up by a private collector at some point, and then donated to or sold perhaps to a public body. So the manuscripts are all either in the British Library, 8 of the 17 are in the British Library, which is quite convenient for studying them. One of those manuscripts has found its way to France now, so it's in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale. All the others are in Oxford or Cambridge University, either the library or the libraries of the individual colleges. Sometimes because they were given. So the one that was owned by a canon of Exeter Cathedral, it was, when he died, it was bought by one of his fellow canons of Exeter, who then donated it to All Souls College in Oxford. And yeah, the one in from Buckfast Abbey is in the British Library now as well.
Okay, so we don't have any at the university then?
We don't have any at Exeter, no. We're fairly low on medieval French. We've got a little bit. We've got well, no, sorry. There's one piece of medieval French at Exeter Cathedral Library, which is a little extract from an Arthurian prose romance. But the university doesn't have. It's got some quite interesting late medieval manuscripts, but none of them in French, sadly. Yeah.
So we've got our final question from Claire Icon. So is Breton found in texts in the southwest, given the proximity of Brittany to this region?
So to answer that question, you'd have to, first of all, be confident that you could distinguish Breton from Cornish at that time. And I'm afraid I'm not certain about how close. I think I have a feeling the languages are fairly close, but I wouldn't want to push my boat out any further than that. So then you'd be looking at Cornish texts, and obviously there are Cornish texts surviving from the Middle Ages. Not many, I believe, but there are some. I mean, it's interesting in a way. Exeter's an interesting place because it's a sort of and Devon is a little bit of a frontier in a way from that point of view. And Exeter, I mean, I've always enjoyed reading the Crown of John novels by Bernard Knight, which are set in medieval Exeter. And you know, interestingly, given the kind of the scene setting that I was doing at the start, they start off with a note about language. I think that's one of the few cases I've seen where he says, of course, you'd have all these different languages being spoken next to. You'd have French, you'd have English, you'd have Cornish. But I'm going to write everything in English, obviously, because this is for an Anglophone audience, so I can't really represent that. But it's worth thinking about what that reality must have been like. And Cornish must have got up here, given the kinds of ties, the ties for trade and so on between Exeter and people travelling to Exeter from Cornwall and West Devon.
Yeah, of course. Cool. Oh, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So thanks so much, Tom. That was a really good talk, and thanks everyone for submitting the questions. It was a really, yeah, I've learned a lot this evening. I didn't know anything about this before. So thanks so much. And everyone, if you have the means to, we've put the link in the chat if you can donate. And otherwise, do register for our event next week, which is the panel discussion with Lise Doucette and David Miliband. Do register for that. It's this time next week. Otherwise, thanks so much and goodbye.